Welcome, traveler. Tonight we journey to 12th century Japan, where war drums echo through misty mountains and honor is tested in fire and steel. Follow young Takeshi Minamoto as he grows from eager son to seasoned warrior, through whispered plots in Kyoto's palaces, brutal winter training, and the storm-tossed seas of Dan no Yura. Close your eyes, hear the clash of blades and the hush of falling cherry blossoms, and let the tale of courage, loyalty, and destiny carry you beyond the night. If this story stirs your imagination, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share so more nighttime travelers can join us on these softly spoken journeys into history. The morning mist clung to Mount Fuji's sacred slopes like the breath of sleeping gods when young Takeshi Minamoto knelt before his father's war table in their ancestral stronghold. The year was 1180, and the Genpei War had just erupted between the mighty Taira and Minamoto clans, a conflict that would drench Japan in blood for the next 5 years and determine who would rule the realm. Lord Minamoto Yoshitsune, weathered by 40 winters of warfare, traced the borders of enemy territory on his silk battle map with a finger that bore the scars of countless duels. His son, barely 16, but already bearing the weight of 6 centuries of warrior heritage, understood that this morning would forever change the trajectory of his existence. Listen well, Takeshi. His father's voice carried the gravity of mountains. You were not born to choose your path. The blood of our ancestors flows through your veins, warriors who served emperors, who faced the Mongol invasions, who carved this domain from chaos with steel and determination. Your destiny was written before you drew your first breath. Outside their fortress walls, the rigid hierarchy of feudal Japan moved with the precision of a vast machine. In the rice paddies that stretched toward the distant mountains, peasants worked in eternal servitude to the land, their backs bent under burdens that would pass to their children and their children's children. There was no social mobility in this world, no escape from the station of your birth. You were samurai, peasant, artisan, or merchant, and that classification would define every moment of your existence until death claimed you. Even among the samurai class, distinctions mattered with deadly precision. The great clans like the Minamoto and Taira commanded provinces and armies, while lesser families served as retainers, forever bound by obligations of loyalty that superseded personal desires. Below them in the social order, yet essential to its functioning, were the eta, the untouchables who dealt with death and leather, who disposed of corpses and slaughtered animals, who were needed desperately but acknowledged reluctantly. Takeshi's gaze drifted to the portrait of his grandfather, Minamoto no Yoritamo, whose stern features seemed to judge him across the generations. That man had helped establish their clan's dominance through cunning and ruthless efficiency, building alliances and destroying enemies with equal skill. Now it fell to this generation to defend what had been won through blood. The Taira grow bold, Yoshitsune continued, his fingers stabbing at positions marked on the map. Taira no Kayamori believes his alliance with the imperial court makes him untouchable. He has forgotten that true power grows from the edge of a blade, not from palace ceremonies. We will remind him of this fundamental truth. A servant entered and prostrated himself on the wooden floor, his forehead touching the polished boards as he waited for permission to speak. In feudal Japan, even the simple act of delivering a message required elaborate protocols that demonstrated proper respect for hierarchy and authority. Rise, Yoshitsune commanded. What news do you bring? My lord, the man gasped, still not daring to lift his eyes. Riders approach from the south. They bear the mon of the Taira clan and request safe passage to deliver message. The room filled with tension, thick enough to cut with a katana. Enemy messengers during wartime were either bearing terms for surrender or delivering declarations of war. Either way, their arrival meant that the period of preparation was ending and the time for action had arrived. Father, Takeshi said carefully, knowing that speaking without permission was dangerous even for a son, what response shall we prepare? Yoshitsune's smile was sharp as winter steel. "We shall listen to what the Terra have to say, and then we shall show them why the Minamoto have never bowed to anyone save the Emperor himself." Through the paper screens, Takeshi could see servants scurrying to prepare for the reception of enemy envoys, a complex ritual that would demonstrate their clan's power and refinement while subtly threatening violence if the message proved unsatisfactory. Every detail mattered in this deadly dance of diplomacy, from the placement of weapons to the quality of tea served to visitors who might soon become corpses. As he helped his father prepare for the meeting, Takeshi felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders like armor forged from the expectations of the dead. His education in the brutal realities of feudal Japan was about to begin in earnest, and he suspected that the boy who had awakened with the dawn would not survive to see another sunset unchanged. The way of the samurai was death, but it was also life lived with such intensity that each moment blazed like a struck flint. Today, he would discover whether 16 years of training had prepared him for the crucible that awaited. The Terra messenger knelt in the formal reception hall like a man balancing on the edge of a blade, knowing that his words would determine whether he returned home with honor or died far from his ancestors' graves. The mon on his silk clothing proclaimed his allegiance to the most powerful clan in Japan, but here in Minamoto territory, that very symbol marked him as an enemy whose life depended entirely on the courtesy of his hosts. Takeshi observed from his position behind his father's seat, noting how the messenger's hand never strayed far from his wakizashi despite the protocols that should have guaranteed his safety. In the delicate arithmetic of feudal honor, a warrior's dignity sometimes required choosing death over delivering shameful news, and the man's nervous energy suggested he carried a message that would not be well received. "Speak," Lord Yoshitsune commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to be obeyed. "What words does Terra no Kayamori send to the Minamoto?" The messenger straightened slightly, drawing on reserves of courage that came from a lifetime of serving one of Japan's great military houses. "Honorable Lord Yoshitsune, my master acknowledges your clan's ancient dignity and noble traditions. However, recent actions by Minamoto forces in the eastern provinces have disturbed the peace that benefits all loyal subjects of His Imperial Majesty." It was a masterfully crafted diplomatic lie, wrapped in sufficient courtesy to avoid immediate insult while delivering a clear threat. The Terra were accusing the Minamoto of rebellion against imperial authority, a charge that could justify military action while placing their enemies in the position of appearing to oppose the emperor himself. "Continue," Yoshitsune replied, his tone betraying nothing of what he might be thinking. In the deadly game of court politics, showing emotion was tantamount to revealing weakness, and weakness invited attack from enemies who understood that survival often required striking first. My lord further suggests that a meeting between the clan heads might resolve these misunderstandings before they grow into conflicts that would surely distress His Imperial Majesty and bring suffering to the innocent people of both domains. The offer was simultaneously reasonable and treacherous. Face-to-face negotiations might prevent war, but they would also provide opportunities for assassination, kidnapping, or political maneuvering that could destroy the Minamoto without requiring open battle. Trust between great clans was a luxury that few could afford and fewer still survived. Takeshi watched his father's face for signs of how the proposal should be interpreted. The older man's expression remained as impassive as carved stone, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested that the answer had already been decided and would not favor peaceful resolution. "Tell your master," Yoshitsune said finally, "that the Minamoto have always served the emperor faithfully and will continue to do so regardless of what others might claim. As for meetings, we prefer the honesty of the battlefield to the deceptions of the council chamber." The dismissal was polite in form but devastating in content. By rejecting negotiations, the Minamoto were effectively declaring that they preferred war to whatever terms the Terra might offer. It was a bold stance that would either secure their independence or ensure their destruction. The messenger bowed deeply, understanding that his diplomatic mission had failed and that he would soon be riding back through hostile territory to report the failure to his masters. I shall convey your response with complete accuracy, my lord. May the ancestors guide both our clans in the trials ahead. After the Terra envoy departed under heavy escort to ensure he reached the border safely, father and son sat in contemplative silence while servants prepared tea according to rituals that had been ancient when the first emperors ruled from Kyoto. The ceremony provided time for reflection and a framework for discussing matters too sensitive for formal council meetings. Was war inevitable? Takeshi asked carefully, knowing that questioning his father's decisions was dangerous, but understanding that his education required grasping the reasoning behind crucial choices. Yoshitsune considered the question while performing the precise movements of the tea ceremony, each gesture carrying centuries of meaning about the proper relationship between host and guest, superior and subordinate, teacher and student. The Terra have grown too powerful, he replied finally. Kayamori believes that controlling the emperor gives him the right to command all other clans. Such arrogance cannot be tolerated, because today's submission becomes tomorrow's slavery. It was a lesson in the fundamental dynamics of feudal politics, where power was always contested and peace was merely the interval between wars. The Minamoto could submit to Terra dominance and preserve their immediate survival, or they could fight for independence and risk everything on the outcome of battles yet to be fought. Outside, snow began to fall with a kind of steady persistence that suggested winter had truly arrived. The weather would complicate military operations, but also provide cover for movements that might be observed too easily during clearer seasons. War in winter was brutal for everyone involved, but it could also provide advantages to forces that were better prepared or more desperate. Prepare yourself, Yoshitsune continued, setting down his teacup with movements that somehow conveyed finality. Tomorrow we begin gathering our allies and marshaling our strength. The Genpei War has begun, and it will not end until one clan or the other lies broken beyond recovery. As night fell over their mountain stronghold, Takeshi understood that his childhood had ended with the departure of the Terra messenger. The boy who had awakened that morning would not exist after tomorrow, replaced by a young warrior whose every breath would be dedicated to victory or honorable death in service to his clan's survival. The way of the samurai demanded such transformations, and those who could not adapt quickly enough would be consumed by forces they could neither control nor escape. Spring arrived like a whispered promise of violence, bringing with it the season when armies could move in battles, could be fought without the crushing difficulties imposed by winter weather. Takeshi had spent the cold months training with an intensity that bordered on obsession, transforming his body into a weapon worthy of the Minamoto name and preparing his mind for the realities of combat that no amount of practice could fully simulate. The first test came at dawn on a morning when cherry blossoms drifted like snow across the training ground where he faced his instructor, Sasaki Kojiro, a Ronin masterless samurai whose skill with the katana was matched only by his willingness to teach difficult lessons through painful experience. The man's own clan had been destroyed in an earlier conflict, leaving him with nothing but his expertise and a bitter understanding of how quickly honor could become meaningless in the face of superior force. Today you learn the difference between demonstration and combat, Kojiro announced, drawing his sword with a fluid grace that marked a true master. Everything you have practiced in safety must now be tested against an opponent who will show no mercy for mistakes. The duel that followed was unlike anything Takeshi had experienced during his years of training. Where previous sparring sessions had been controlled exercises designed to build skill gradually, this encounter was conducted with live steel and genuine intent to harm. Every movement carried the possibility of serious injury or death, transforming familiar techniques into desperate gambits for survival. Kojiro's first attack came without warning. a diagonal cut that would have opened Takeshi's chest if he had not managed to get his own blade into position at the last possible moment. The collision of steel on steel sent vibrations up his arms and reminded him that real combat was as much about endurance as technique. Faster, the instructor commanded, following up with a series of strikes that forced Takeshi to abandon offensive thinking in favor of pure defense. In battle, hesitation is death. Your enemy will not wait for you to remember the proper counter for his attack. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. All the elegant forms and theoretical principles that Takeshi had memorized meant nothing if he could not apply them instinctively under pressure. The way of the sword required integration of mind, body, and spirit to a degree that could only be achieved through experiences that bordered on trauma. As the morning progressed, other young samurai gathered to watch the training session, understanding that Kojiro's instruction was preparing them all for trials that would come sooner than any of them preferred. The Genpei War was gathering momentum across Japan, with both sides recruiting allies and positioning forces for campaigns that would determine the future of the realm. Your technique improves, Kojiro observed during a brief rest, wiping blood from a shallow cut on his forearm, where Takeshi's blade had finally penetrated his defense. But you still fight like someone who expects to survive the encounter. True mastery comes only when you accept death as inevitable and focus entirely on ensuring that your enemy dies first. It was the core paradox of Bushido, the way of the warrior that demanded absolute commitment to life through absolute acceptance of death. A samurai who fought to preserve his own existence would always be inferior to one who fought only to fulfill his obligations to lord and clan, regardless of personal cost. The philosophical discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger bearing news that would transform theoretical preparation into immediate reality. Enemy forces had been detected moving through the mountain passes that protected the Minamoto heartland, suggesting that the Terra had decided to strike first rather than wait for their opponents to complete their own preparations. How many? Lord Yoshitsune demanded, emerging from the main hall where he had been meeting with his senior retainers to discuss strategy and logistics. The scout, still breathing hard from his rapid journey, struggled to provide accurate intelligence about forces he had observed from concealment. At least 500 samurai, my lord, with perhaps twice that number of Ishigaru foot soldiers. They move under the banner of Terra no Tamamori and seem to be probing our defenses rather than attempting immediate assault. It was both good news and bad news wrapped together. The enemy force was large enough to pose a serious threat, but small enough to suggest that this was a reconnaissance in force rather than the main attack. That meant the Minamoto had time to respond effectively, but it also meant that larger battles would follow once the Terra had gathered better intelligence about their opponent's capabilities. Summon the War Council, Yoshitsune commanded, and send riders to our allies. It is time to discover who will stand with us when words become deeds. As preparations began for what would likely be Takeshi's first real battle, he found himself thinking not about glory or honor, but about the simple mechanics of survival in a world where a moment's inattention could end everything he had ever been or might become. The cherry blossoms continued to fall around him like a reminder of life's fragility, beautiful in their brief existence, and forgotten the moment they touched the ground. The way of the samurai was indeed death, but it was also the path that led to the only form of immortality available to mortals, the memory of deeds performed with such skill and courage that they would be remembered long after the flesh that performed them had returned to dust. The attack began in the gray twilight before dawn, when shadows still offered concealment, but enough light existed to distinguish friend from enemy in the chaos of close combat. Takeshi crouched behind a fallen tree at the edge of Terra no Tamamori's camp, watching 500 enemy warriors struggle to respond to an assault that had caught them at their most vulnerable moment. The Minamoto charge struck like an avalanche of steel and fury, transforming peaceful morning into a hellscape of screaming horses, clashing weapons, and dying men. Takeshi's role as a messenger kept him away from the heaviest fighting, but close enough to observe how quickly organized formations could dissolve into individual struggles for survival when surprised by determined attackers. His first glimpse of real combat shattered every romantic notion he had harbored about the nobility of warfare. There was nothing elegant about the way men died, no poetic final words or graceful collapses, just desperate struggles that ended when one combatant made a mistake that the other exploited with lethal efficiency. The cherry blossoms that drifted across the battlefield seemed to mock the brutality below with their delicate beauty. "Message for Lord Noriyori," shouted a blood-soaked samurai who had fought his way clear of the enemy lines. "The left flank is collapsing. We need reinforcements or we'll be surrounded." Takeshi accepted the verbal message and spurred his horse toward where Noriyori commanded the reserve forces, weaving between scattered combats and trying not to think about how easily he could become another casualty if an enemy archer spotted him. The battlefield was a maze of opportunities for sudden death, where a moment's inattention could result in an arrow through the throat or a spear between the ribs. The message delivered. He found himself with a brief respite to observe the larger pattern of the battle. The Minamoto surprise attack had achieved its initial objectives, disrupting enemy formations and creating panic in their camp. But Tamamori was proving to be a capable commander who was rallying his forces more quickly than anticipated. "You," called Lord Noriyori, spotting Takeshi among the reserve troops. "Ride to your father and tell him that we can hold the center, but cannot advance further without support. The enemy is reforming faster than we expected." Another message, another dangerous ride across a battlefield where death waited around every tree and behind every rock. As Takeshi guided his horse through the chaos, he began to understand why experienced warriors spoke of battle as a dance, not because it was graceful, but because survival required perfect timing and the ability to respond instantly to changing rhythms of advance and retreat. He found his father directing the main assault against the enemy command position, where Tamamori's banner still flew despite the surrounding carnage. The Terra commander had positioned himself at the center of his force's resistance, inspiring his men through personal example, while coordinating their defense with tactical skill that had prevented complete collapse. "Father," Takeshi called, pulling his horse to a stop beside Yoshitsune's position. "Lord Noriyori reports that the left flank needs support to maintain its position." Yoshitsune absorbed the information without taking his eyes off the enemy lines, where he was calculating whether one final push might break terror resistance or simply expose his own forces to counterattack. Command decisions in battle had to be made with incomplete information under extreme pressure, and wrong choices could transform victory into defeat within minutes. "Tell Noriyori to hold his position but prepare for withdrawal," Yoshitsune decided. "We have achieved what we came for, demonstrating that the Terra can be defeated. Attempting to destroy them completely would risk our own destruction." It was a lesson in the difference between tactical success and strategic wisdom. The Minamoto had proven their capabilities and bloodied their enemies, but pressing their advantage too far might squander gains that had been purchased with blood and courage. The castle itself was a marvel of engineering, with defensive innovations that incorporated the latest military technology. The stained glass in the chapel demonstrated advances in both chemistry and artistic technique. The very organization of the household revealed administrative sophistication that contradicted stereotypes about medieval chaos. Women play crucial roles in this cultural development, Eleanor continued. Hildegard of Bingen advances both medicine and theology. Marie de France creates new literary forms. It was dangerous work that required exposing himself to enemy observation, but it also provided him with a comprehensive view of how skilled leadership could extract maximum value from a tactical situation. As the Minamoto forces withdrew in good order toward their mountain strongholds, Takeshi counted the cost of his first real battle. 3 fingers on his left hand bore cuts from an enemy wakizashi that had gotten closer than his training had prepared him to handle. His armor showed dents and scratches that would require extensive repair. Most sobering of all, his horse bore an arrow wound that would leave the animal lame and unsuitable for future combat. But he was alive, unbroken, and educated in ways that no amount of peaceful training could have provided. The boy who had ridden into battle that morning had been replaced by a young warrior who understood the difference between theory and practice in the most fundamental terms possible. The Terra would remember this defeat and plan accordingly for future encounters. The Genpei War was far from over, and each victory simply established the conditions for more difficult battles ahead. But for today, the Minamoto had proven that they could stand against their enemies and prevail through skill, courage, and the willingness to risk everything for clan survival. The way of the samurai led through such trials, testing each generation's worthiness to inherit the legacy of their ancestors. Takeshi had passed his first examination, but he understood that many more awaited him on the path toward whatever destiny the gods had prepared for his clan and his country. 3 days after the battle, as the Minamoto forces consolidated their position in the mountain stronghold that had sheltered their clan for generations, Takeshi discovered that victory carried burdens he had never anticipated. The wounded required constant care, the dead demanded proper funeral rites, and the living struggled with memories that would shadow their dreams for years to come. He found himself assigned to assist with the interrogation of captured Terra samurai, a duty that tested his understanding of honor in ways that pure combat never could. The prisoners knelt in perfect seiza position despite their wounds, maintaining dignity even in defeat, while awaiting decisions that would determine whether they lived to serve new masters or died to preserve old loyalties. State your name and rank, commanded Minamoto no Yashinaka, the clan elder responsible for determining the fate of enemy captives. His approach was formally correct, but tinged with the impatience of someone who had more pressing concerns than managing prisoners of war. The first captive was a young man perhaps 2 years older than Takeshi, his armor bearing the mon of a minor branch of the Terra family tree. Blood from a head wound had dried across his face, but his eyes remained alert and defiant despite his desperate circumstances. "I am Terra no Atsumori, second son of Terra no Tsunemori, faithful retainer of his lordship Terra no Kayamori," the prisoner replied with the precise formality that marked proper samurai education. "I request the honor of seppuku rather than the shame of serving enemies of my rightful lord." It was exactly the response that Bushido demanded, a preference for honorable death over dishonorable survival. But Takeshi could see the conflict in Yashinaka's expression as the older man weighed political necessity against warrior tradition. Dead prisoners provided no intelligence about enemy plans, while living prisoners might be exchanged for captured Minamoto warriors or converted into valuable allies. "Your courage honors your bloodline," Yashinaka replied carefully, "but your death would serve no useful purpose, while your knowledge might preserve many lives on both sides. Will you accept parole and provide information about Terra dispositions in exchange for honorable treatment?" The offer was reasonable by the standards of civilized warfare, but it placed Atsumori in an impossible position. Accepting meant betraying his clan's secrets to their enemies, while refusing meant insisting on a death that accomplished nothing beyond satisfying abstract principles of loyalty. "I will not betray my lord trust," Atsumori said finally, "but neither will I throw away life that might yet serve some worthy purpose. Grant me time to consider whether honor permits cooperation with honorable enemies." It was a diplomatic response that avoided immediate commitment while acknowledging the complexity of his situation. Takeshi found himself admiring the young Terra warrior's ability to navigate between competing obligations without abandoning either his principles or his pragmatic assessment of available options. The interrogation continued with other prisoners, each presenting different aspects of the same fundamental dilemma. Some requested immediate death rather than face the shame of capture. Others offered their services to the Minamoto in exchange for protection of their families and retainers. A few maintained absolute silence, refusing to acknowledge questions or respond to either threats or inducements. What would you do in their position? Yashinaka asked Takeshi during a brief recess, recognizing an opportunity to test the younger man's understanding of the ethical complexities that warfare created. The question forced Takeshi to examine his own assumptions about loyalty, honor, and survival in circumstances where abstract principles collided with practical necessities. His training had prepared him to die for his lord without hesitation, but it had not addressed what obligations prisoners might have to preserve their own lives for future service. "I hope I would choose death before betrayal," he replied honestly. "But I also hope that I would never face such a choice because I would die in battle before allowing myself to be captured." Yashinaka smiled grimly, spoken like someone who has never been surrounded by enemies, with no possibility of escape. Battle rarely provides the clean choices that we prefer to imagine. More often, it forces us to select the least dishonorable option from alternatives that all involve some form of compromise. That evening, as Takeshi walked through the compound where the wounded were recovering from their injuries, he reflected on how much his understanding of samurai ideals had changed since his first real combat experience. The clear distinctions between right and wrong that had seemed so obvious during peaceful training became blurred when examined in the harsh light of actual warfare. In one room, he found a Minamoto retainer whose left arm had been severed at the elbow by a katana. The man was conscious and alert, but his fighting days were over forever. Without the ability to wield weapons effectively, his value as a warrior had ended, leaving him dependent on clan charity for whatever years remained to him. "Young master," the injured man said weakly, recognizing Takeshi despite the bandages that covered half his face. "Will you carry a message to my son? Tell him that his father died well, even if his body survived the battle." It was a poignant reminder that in feudal Japan, a warrior's identity was so completely tied to his martial function that losing the ability to fight was equivalent to a form of social death. The disabled veteran would be cared for according to the clan's obligations, but he would never again be regarded as a complete man by his peers or his community. Such observations accumulated in Takeshi's mind like drops of water filling a vessel, gradually transforming his naive enthusiasm for military glory into a more mature appreciation of warfare's true costs. Victory was not just a matter of defeating enemies on the battlefield, but of managing the human consequences that survival created for winners and losers alike. The Genpei War would continue for years, producing many more battles and countless more casualties. Each engagement would test not only the participants' martial skills, but their ability to maintain their humanity while participating in organized violence on a massive scale. The way of the samurai was indeed death, but it was also life lived under conditions that revealed both the nobility and the tragedy inherent in human nature when pushed to its absolute limits. Winter's grip loosened as the second year of the Genpei War began, bringing with it unexpected visitors to the Minamoto stronghold. A merchant caravan arrived under flags of neutrality, led by a man whose wealth had grown so vast that even daimyo sought his counsel. Watanabe Ichiro commanded respect not through bloodline or sword skill, but through his mastery of the economic forces that made warfare possible. Takeshi observed the merchant's arrival from the watchtower, noting how Watanabe's retinue moved with the confidence of men who knew their value transcended traditional social boundaries. In the rigid hierarchy of feudal Japan, merchants occupied the lowest official rank, yet their control of trade routes and currency made them indispensable to the very samurai who looked down upon them. That man, observed Sasaki Kojiro, joining Takeshi at his observation post, has financed more battles than most generals have fought. His gold flows to whichever side offers the best terms for repayment, regardless of political loyalties or family honor. The meeting between Watanabe and Lord Yoshitsune took place in the main hall, where diplomatic protocols struggled to accommodate a guest whose social status was theoretically inferior, but whose practical power could not be ignored. Takeshi was permitted to attend as part of his continuing education in the complexities of leadership during wartime. Honorable Lord Yoshitsune, Watanabe began with perfectly calibrated courtesy. I bring intelligence that may prove valuable to your clan's survival. The Terra have approached me with requests for loans to finance expanded military operations. Their offers are generous, but their ability to repay depends entirely on achieving total victory. The merchant's words carried implications that extended far beyond simple business arrangements. If the Terra were seeking outside financing, it suggested that their own resources were becoming strained by the costs of prolonged warfare. More importantly, Watanabe's presence indicated that he was offering the Minamoto an opportunity to outbid their enemies for financial support. What terms would you propose? Yoshitsune asked carefully, understanding that this conversation would test his ability to balance clan honor with practical necessity. Watanabe smiled with the confidence of someone accustomed to complex negotiations. Exclusive trading rights in territories under Minamoto control, protection for my caravans traveling through contested regions, and perhaps most importantly, a voice in determining economic policies that affect commerce throughout Japan. The proposal was revolutionary in its implications. Accepting would mean granting a merchant influence over governmental decisions traditionally reserved for the warrior class. It would acknowledge that economic power deserved recognition alongside military prowess, fundamentally altering the social structure that had governed Japan for centuries. Such arrangements would require careful consideration, Yoshitsune replied diplomatically, and consultation with allies whose support depends on maintaining traditional relationships between the classes. Over the following days, Takeshi found himself assigned to escort Watanabe through their domain, ostensibly as a guide, but actually as an observer whose insights might help his father evaluate the merchant's true intentions. The experience proved educational in unexpected ways, revealing perspectives on feudal society that his samurai training had not prepared him to understand. Young Lord, Watanabe observed as they toured a village where peasants worked fields that had been damaged during recent fighting. Your father's victory preserved these people's homes, but victory alone cannot restore their prosperity. They need seed grain, farming tools, and security for the harvest season. Military success means nothing if it cannot be converted into economic recovery. It was a sobering assessment that challenged Takeshi's assumptions about the relationship between warfare and governance. His education had focused on achieving victory through superior martial skills, but Watanabe was suggesting that lasting success required understanding forces that operated beyond the battlefield. You speak as if gold were more powerful than steel, Takeshi replied, testing the merchant's philosophy against samurai values. Watanabe chuckled softly. Steel can take a castle in a day, but gold can hold it for a generation. Your sword commands respect, but my coins command loyalty from people who have no intention of dying for abstract principles of honor. That evening, as they made camp in a roadside inn that served travelers regardless of their social status, Takeshi questioned Watanabe more directly about his motivations and methods. The merchant's responses revealed a worldview that was both more pragmatic and more cynical than anything Takeshi had encountered among the warrior class. Honor, Watanabe explained over sake that was probably too expensive for their surroundings, is a luxury that only the secure can afford. I have seen great lords brought low by their adherence to principles that their enemies ignored. The Genpei War will end when one side runs out of money to pay their armies, not when one produces superior warriors. The conversation continued late into the night, covering subjects that ranged from currency exchange to the proper relationship between central authority and local commerce. Throughout their discussion, Takeshi found himself impressed by the merchant's grasp of interconnections that his military training had not prepared him to appreciate. When they returned to the stronghold, Takeshi was tasked with providing his assessment of Watanabe's character and proposals to his father. The report required balancing honest observation with tactical considerations that could affect his clan's survival in an increasingly complex conflict. The merchant speaks truth about economic realities, Takeshi concluded, but his loyalty extends only as far as his profit margins. He would serve us faithfully as long as we can pay him, and betray us instantly if our enemies offered better terms. Lord Yoshitsune nodded thoughtfully. Then we must ensure that he finds our success more profitable than our failure. In war, as in commerce, the most reliable allies are those whose interests align with our own. The decision to accept Watanabe's proposals marked a turning point in the Minamoto's approach to the Genpei War, acknowledging that victory would require more than martial valor and family honor. The ancient social order was beginning to adapt to new realities, though few recognized how fundamentally these changes would transform Japanese society. Spring brought disturbing news from the ancient capital of Kyoto, where Emperor Antoku, barely 6 years old, reigned under the complete control of his Terra grandfather, Kayamori. A messenger arrived bearing imperial edicts written on silk so fine it seemed to glow in the lamplight, commanding all loyal subjects to support the government's efforts to restore peace and order throughout the realm. Takeshi was present when his father read the documents, watching Lord Yoshitsune's face for signs of how these communications should be interpreted. The relationship between emperors and military strongmen had always been delicate, with both sides maintaining fictions about authority and legitimacy that everyone understood, but no one dared question openly. His Imperial Majesty, Yoshitsune announced to his assembled retainers, expresses concern about rebellious activities in the eastern provinces and calls upon all subjects to demonstrate their loyalty through appropriate action. The words were carefully chosen to avoid direct accusations, while making clear that the Minamoto were being branded as rebels against imperial authority. It was a masterful piece of political theater that could justify military action against them while placing them in the impossible position of appearing to oppose the emperor himself. "What response do we contemplate?" asked Minamoto no Noriyori, understanding that their reply would determine whether they could maintain any claim to legitimacy in their struggle against Terra dominance. The question hung in the air like smoke from incense, heavy with implications that extended far beyond immediate military concerns. Rejecting imperial commands would confirm accusations of rebellion, but accepting them would legitimize Terra control over the government and effectively end Minamoto independence. "We shall respond," Yoshitsune said finally, "that the Minamoto have always served the emperor faithfully and will continue to do so by protecting his majesty from advisors who abuse imperial authority for private gain." It was a brilliant counterattack that accepted imperial legitimacy while questioning Terra motives, positioning the Minamoto as loyal subjects protecting their sovereign from manipulation rather than rebels challenging rightful authority. The strategy transformed accusations of treason into claims of patriotic duty. Within days, a delegation was assembled to carry this response to Kyoto, ostensibly to demonstrate respect for imperial wishes, while actually attempting to build support among court factions that opposed Terra dominance. Takeshi was included in the group, officially as a guard, but actually as an observer whose youth might allow him access to information that more senior figures could not obtain. The journey to the ancient capital revealed a countryside still bearing scars from previous conflicts, where abandoned villages and overgrown fields testified to the human cost of political instability. The rigid social order that governed peaceful times had been disrupted by warfare, creating opportunities for social mobility, but also destroying traditional sources of security and identity. Kyoto itself presented a study in contrasts between magnificent palaces and impoverished neighborhoods, where courtiers maintained elaborate ceremonies while common people struggled with poverty and uncertainty. The imperial court's removal from practical governance had allowed local problems to fester, while aristocrats focused on aesthetic refinements and factional competitions. The formal presentation of the Minamoto response took place in the Shishinden, the main ceremonial hall of the imperial palace, where every gesture carried centuries of precedent and political meaning. Takeshi found himself observing not just the official proceedings, but the subtle interplay of personalities and interests that would ultimately determine whether any peaceful resolution remained possible. Emperor Entoku sat on a chrysanthemum throne with the rigid stillness of a child who had been trained to embody divine authority despite his complete dependence on adult advisors. Beside him stood Terra no Kayamori, whose presence dominated the hall despite his theoretically subordinate position as the emperor's grandfather and chief minister. The Minamoto Pledge, announced their senior diplomat, absolute loyalty to His Imperial Majesty's person and eternal devotion to the preservation of legitimate imperial authority against all who would abuse it for private purposes. The statement was a masterpiece of diplomatic ambiguity, expressing loyalty while implying that current imperial policies were illegitimate products of terror manipulation. Kayamori's face remained impassive, but Takeshi could sense the older man's anger at being outmaneuvered in his own political stronghold. His Majesty is pleased, Kayamori replied on behalf of the child emperor, to hear expressions of loyalty from subjects who have recently demonstrated their devotion through military actions in the eastern provinces. Perhaps further demonstrations of such loyalty would help clarify the sincerity of these pledges. The response was equally masterful, acknowledging the Minamoto statement while demanding concrete proof of submission that would effectively end their independence. The diplomatic chess match continued through subtle verbal exchanges that tested each side's ability to maintain their positions without openly breaking the protocols that made negotiation possible. During breaks in the formal sessions, Takeshi observed the complex factional divisions within the court itself. Not all nobles supported Terra dominance, but opposition required careful concealment to avoid political destruction. The imperial system provided multiple centers of influence where dissatisfied aristocrats could maintain alternative power networks while waiting for opportunities to challenge the current order. It was during one such recess that Takeshi received an unexpected summons to a private meeting with Prince Machihito, the emperor's uncle and a potential claimant to imperial succession should circumstances change. The invitation came through channels so discreet that even the Minamoto senior diplomats were unaware of it. The prince received him in a small garden pavilion where the sound of flowing water would mask their conversation from potential eavesdroppers. Machihito was perhaps 30 years old, with the refined features and pale complexion that marked him as someone who had never engaged in physical labor, but his eyes held an intelligence that suggested political sophistication beyond his ceremonial role. "Young samurai," the prince said after the initial courtesies, "you have observed our capital with fresh eyes. What do you see when you look upon the current state of imperial governance?" It was a dangerous question that invited criticism of existing arrangements, while potentially testing Takeshi's loyalty to his own clan's interests. His response would need to balance honesty with discretion, providing useful intelligence without compromising either his family's position or his own safety. "Your Highness," Takeshi replied carefully, "I see institutions of great antiquity adapting to circumstances that their founders never anticipated. The challenge appears to be preserving what is valuable from tradition while addressing problems that traditional methods cannot solve." The prince nodded approvingly, a diplomatic answer that reveals understanding without commitment. "Tell me, do you believe that current arrangements serve the emperor's true interests, or do they primarily benefit those who claim to speak in his name?" The conversation continued for nearly an hour, touching on subjects that ranged from the proper relationship between military and civilian authority to the role of economic considerations in governmental decision-making. Throughout their discussion, Takeshi sensed that he was being evaluated for purposes that remained hidden, possibly recruitment to some alternative political arrangement. When the meeting finally ended, Prince Machihido's parting words carried implications that would influence Takeshi's thinking long after he returned to Minamoto territory. Remember that emperors rule by divine mandate, but that mandate can be transferred when current holders prove unworthy of the trust placed in them. Walking back through the palace corridors toward his assigned quarters, Takeshi realized that the Genpei War was more than a simple conflict between rival military clans. It was part of a larger struggle over the fundamental nature of authority in Japan, testing whether traditional imperial legitimacy could survive challenge by effective military government. The return journey from Kyoto proved more perilous than anyone had anticipated, as Terra forces had positioned patrols along the major routes to intercept Minamoto messengers carrying intelligence back to their strongholds. What should have been a routine diplomatic mission became a running battle through mountain passes where every shadow might conceal enemy archers and every bridge could be a trap. Takeshi found himself separated from the main diplomatic party during an ambush at a narrow valley crossing, forced to make his way back to Minamoto territory through wilderness tracks that tested both his survival skills and his understanding of the broader strategic situation. The 3-day journey on foot provided time for reflection on everything he had observed in the imperial capital. The political complexities revealed during his stay in Kyoto had shattered his naive assumptions about the nature of loyalty and legitimacy in feudal Japan. The child emperor was clearly a puppet controlled by his Terra relatives, but that puppet status didn't diminish the legal authority of imperial commands. Prince Machihido's hints about alternative arrangements suggested that even within the imperial family, not everyone accepted current power structures as permanent or legitimate. When he finally reached the safety of his family's domain, Takeshi discovered that events had moved quickly during his absence. A massive Terra army was advancing from the west under the command of Terra no Munamori, Kayamori's son and heir, apparently intent on crushing Minamoto resistance before it could spread to other provinces. The situation has become desperate. Lord Yoshitsune explained during the War Council that convened immediately upon Takeshi's return. Our allies waver because they fear imperial displeasure. Our enemies grow bolder because they believe they fight with divine sanction. And our own resources diminish with each passing month. The intelligence that Takeshi brought from Kyoto painted an even grimmer picture. The Terra had successfully positioned themselves as defenders of imperial authority, making opposition to their policies appear treasonous. Without a compelling counter-narrative that could legitimize resistance, the Minamoto faced the prospect of fighting an unwinnable war against enemies who commanded both superior resources and moral authority. There may be another path, Takeshi reported carefully, but it would require abandoning our current strategy in favor of something far more dangerous. He described his conversation with Prince Machihido, emphasizing the prince's apparent dissatisfaction with current arrangements and his hints about the possibility of alternative imperial leadership. If the Minamoto could somehow engineer a change in imperial succession, they might transform themselves from rebels into loyalists, defending legitimate authority against usurpers. The proposal generated intense debate among the assembled war leaders, with older retainers expressing horror at the idea of manipulating imperial succession, while younger officers argued that conventional approaches had already failed. The risk was enormous. If their conspiracy were discovered, it would justify the most extreme measures against them. But the potential rewards were equally significant. Such an undertaking, observed Minamoto no Yashinaka, would require skills we do not possess and resources we cannot spare. We are warriors, not court intriguers. How could we hope to compete with the Terra in their own arena of political manipulation? The question revealed the fundamental weakness in their position. The Minamoto had built their power through military competence and territorial control, but the Terra had mastered the arts of court politics and bureaucratic administration. Attempting to challenge them on their chosen battlefield would require expertise that took generations to develop. Perhaps, suggested Takeshi, remembering his conversations with the merchant Watanabe, We need allies whose skills complement our own weaknesses. Not all power flows through traditional channels, and not all influential people hold official positions. The discussion that followed explored possibilities that had never been seriously considered by any of the participants. Could merchant networks provide intelligence gathering capabilities that rivaled those of official spy services? Could disaffected court nobles be recruited to support alternative political arrangements? Could religious institutions be persuaded to question the divine sanction claimed by current rulers? As autumn deepened into winter, the Minamoto began implementing a strategy that combined conventional military preparation with unconventional political warfare. Secret messages were dispatched to potential allies throughout Japan, testing their willingness to support a change in imperial leadership. Merchant contacts were cultivated to provide intelligence about Terra financial resources and strategic planning. Religious leaders were approached with carefully crafted arguments about the spiritual implications of illegitimate rule. The effort required coordination between military operations and political activities that had never been attempted on such a scale. Traditional samurai virtues of direct action and personal loyalty had to be balanced with the subtle requirements of conspiracy and manipulation. For many participants, the psychological adjustment was as difficult as any tactical challenge they had faced in conventional warfare. Takeshi found himself at the center of these activities, his youth and relative political innocence making him useful for missions that more prominent figures could not undertake without arousing suspicion. The role required skills that his martial training had not developed, the ability to lie convincingly, to maintain multiple identities simultaneously, and to evaluate the trustworthiness of people whose motivations remained partially hidden. The most delicate negotiations involved Prince Machihito himself, who had to be approached carefully enough to avoid alerting Terra intelligence networks, while being offered sufficient inducements to risk his own position in support of Minamoto objectives. The prince's cooperation was essential, but securing it would require promises that might prove impossible to fulfill if their conspiracy succeeded. "We offer you the throne that is rightfully yours," Takeshi told the prince during a clandestine meeting arranged through Buddhist intermediaries, "in exchange for your support in legitimizing resistance to Terra usurpation of imperial authority." The proposal was breathtaking in its audacity, a minor branch of the Minamoto clan promising to install a new emperor in exchange for political support against their enemies. Success would transform the entire character of the Genpei War, while failure would doom everyone involved to execution as traitors to the established order. Prince Machihito's response would determine whether the Minamoto had found a path to victory or had simply committed themselves to a more spectacular form of destruction. Prince Machihito's answer came in the form of a secret document that would transform the nature of the Genpei War from a clan conflict into a struggle for imperial legitimacy itself. Written in his own hand and bearing his personal seal, the prince issued a call for all loyal subjects to rise against the Terra regime that had corrupted imperial authority for private gain. Takeshi was among the few permitted to read the document before copies were distributed throughout Japan, understanding that he was witnessing a moment that would reshape the political landscape for generations to come. The prince's words carried the weight of divine authority, transforming the Minamoto from rebels into champions of legitimate imperial rule. By the mandate of heaven and the authority vested in imperial blood, the document proclaimed, "We call upon all faithful subjects to restore rightful governance to the realm and to cast down those who have perverted sacred institutions for worldly ambition." The effect was immediate and profound. Within weeks, reports arrived of uprisings in provinces where local lords had been waiting for some excuse to challenge Terra dominance. The imperial endorsement provided both legal justification and moral authority for actions that would otherwise have appeared treasonous, transforming isolated resistance into a coordinated movement for political change. However, the Terra response was equally swift and far more brutal than anyone had anticipated. Kayamori declared Prince Machihito a traitor manipulated by Minamoto conspirators, ordered the arrest of suspected sympathizers throughout the government, and dispatched armies to crush the rebellion before it could gain further momentum. They moved faster than we expected, reported Minamoto no Yuki, who had barely escaped from Kyoto before terror forces could arrest him. Kayamori understands that this is no longer a simple military conflict, but a struggle for the legitimacy of his entire regime. He will use every resource at his disposal to destroy us completely. The news that followed confirmed their worst fears. Prince Machihito had been forced to flee the capital when terror warriors stormed his palace, and was now seeking refuge in religious institutions that offered sanctuary to political fugitives. The conspiracy had been exposed before it could achieve its objectives, leaving the participants vulnerable to retaliation while providing their enemies with justification for extreme measures. "We have forced the issue," Lord Yoshitsune observed grimly, "but we have not yet won the outcome. Now we must prove on the battlefield that heaven truly supports our cause, or admit that we have brought destruction upon ourselves through overambition." The winter of 1180 became a season of desperate preparation, as both sides marshaled their forces for what everyone understood would be decisive campaigns. The Minamoto could no longer hope for limited objectives or negotiated settlements. They had committed themselves to total victory or total destruction, with no middle ground remaining. Takeshi found his role evolving again as the political dimensions of their struggle became as important as the military aspects. His experience with court protocols and conspiracy management made him valuable for missions that required both martial skill and diplomatic sophistication, while his youth continued to provide cover for activities that older participants could not undertake safely. One such mission took him to the Byodo Inn temple complex, where Prince Machihito had taken refuge among Buddhist monks who maintained strict neutrality in political conflicts. The prince's location was known to terror forces, but attacking a sacred site would risk alienating religious institutions throughout Japan, creating spiritual consequences that even Kayamori hesitated to accept. The situation grows impossible, the prince confided during their secret meeting in a meditation hall, where golden Buddha statues seemed to observe their conspiracy with serene disapproval. "I cannot remain here indefinitely, but leaving would expose me to immediate capture. The Terra have surrounded the temple with forces that prevent escape while avoiding direct violation of sanctuary rights." The standoff represented the larger dilemma facing all participants in the rebellion. They had successfully challenged Terra authority and gained some popular support, but they lacked the resources to sustain prolonged conflict against enemies who controlled the machinery of government. Time favored the established order, which could gradually eliminate threats through siege warfare and political pressure. "Your Highness," Takeshi suggested carefully, "perhaps the solution lies not in avoiding conflict, but in choosing its location and timing. If you could escape to Minamoto territory, your presence would legitimize our resistance, while providing you with protection that religious sanctuary cannot guarantee indefinitely." The escape plan that they developed required coordination between temple defenders, Minamoto infiltrators, and sympathetic merchants who could provide transportation and concealment. Its success would depend on precise timing and the willingness of all participants to risk their lives for political objectives that remained uncertain. On the appointed night, as snow fell heavily enough to provide natural concealment for their movements, the most dangerous phase of their conspiracy began. Prince Machihito, disguised as a traveling monk, attempted to reach a rendezvous point where Minamoto warriors waited with fast horses and provisions for a desperate ride to safety. The plan failed catastrophically when Terra patrols detected their movement and launched an immediate pursuit. The running battle that followed through snow-covered mountain passes became the stuff of legend, with a handful of Minamoto warriors fighting desperately to protect their imperial ally, while enemy forces closed in from all directions. Prince Machihito died at the Uji Bridge, struck down by Terra arrows as he attempted to cross the river that represented the boundary between capture and freedom. His death ended the conspiracy that had briefly transformed the character of their struggle, but it also created a martyr whose memory would inspire continued resistance to Terra rule. As Takeshi helped carry the prince's body back to the temple for proper funeral rites, he understood that their failure had somehow become a different kind of success. The attempt itself had demonstrated that Terra authority was not unquestionable, while the prince's death provided emotional power that mere political arguments could never achieve. The sacred rebellion had ended, but the ideas it represented would continue to influence the course of the Genpei War. Legitimacy was not simply a matter of controlling current institutions, but of embodying principles that people were willing to die defending. The Minamoto had lost a battle, but they had won something potentially more valuable, a cause that transcended clan interests and appealed to fundamental concepts of justice and rightful authority. Spring of 1181 brought news that transformed the entire strategic landscape of the Genpei War. Terra no Kayamori, the architect of Terra dominance, and the most formidable opponent the Minamoto had ever faced, died suddenly of fever in his Kyoto palace, leaving his clan without the ruthless intelligence that had made their political supremacy possible. Takeshi received the news while training with a group of Shigeru foot soldiers whose loyalty to the Minamoto cause had been tested through months of irregular warfare against superior enemy forces. These men were not samurai, but their dedication to their lords and their skill with spear and bow had proven invaluable in the kind of conflicts that characterized the ongoing struggle. "The great serpent is dead," announced one of the older soldiers, a peasant who had risen to leadership through battlefield competence rather than birth. But serpents sometimes become more dangerous when they die, thrashing about and striking everything within reach. The observation proved prophetic as reports arrived of increased Terra military activity throughout Japan, suggesting that Kayamori's heirs were attempting to consolidate their position through shows of force rather than the subtle political manipulation that had characterized their fathers. Approach to power. "This is our opportunity," declared Minamoto no Yashinaka during the war council that convened to assess the changed circumstances. The Terra leadership is fractured, their allies uncertain, and their enemies emboldened. Spring of 1181 brought news that transformed the entire strategic landscape of the Genpei War. Terra no Kayamori, the architect of Terra dominance, and the most formidable opponent the Minamoto had ever faced, died suddenly of fever in his Kyoto palace, leaving his clan without the ruthless intelligence that had made their political supremacy possible. Takeshi received the news while training with a group of Shigeru foot soldiers whose loyalty to the Minamoto cause had been tested through months of irregular warfare against superior enemy forces. "We must strike while they struggle to maintain unity." The campaign that followed would test everything Takeshi had learned about warfare, politics, and leadership during his 3 years of involvement in the conflict. No longer a simple observer or messenger, he was now expected to command troops in battle while managing the complex relationships between different social classes that comprised Minamoto forces. His first independent command involved leading a mixed force of samurai and Shigeru against a Terra stronghold that controlled a crucial mountain pass between their territory and potential allies in the eastern provinces. The mission required both tactical competence and diplomatic skill, since success depended on coordinating with local rebels whose motivations were not always aligned with Minamoto objectives. The siege of Uchiyama Castle became a masterclass in the evolution of Japanese warfare, where traditional methods had to be adapted to address practical challenges that pure martial prowess could not solve. The fortress was too strong for direct assault, but too well supplied for simple blockade, requiring innovative approaches that combined military pressure with psychological warfare. "The castle can be taken," Takeshi explained to his subordinate commanders, "but only if we can convince the defenders that resistance is futile while offering them honorable terms for surrender. We lack the resources for a prolonged siege, and they lack the hope for timely relief." The negotiations that followed required all of Takeshi's experience with court protocols and conspiracy management, as he attempted to identify factional divisions within the garrison while maintaining pressure through carefully orchestrated demonstrations of Minamoto's strength. The process revealed how much his understanding of conflict had evolved from simple concepts of warrior courage to complex appreciation of human motivation under extreme stress. The breakthrough came when he identified the castle's chief administrator as someone whose loyalty to the Terra was based on pragmatic calculation rather than emotional attachment. Through intermediaries, Takeshi was able to offer the man financial incentives and political protection in exchange for cooperation that would make the fortress untenable for its defenders. Honor, the administrator observed during their secret meeting, is a luxury that the dead cannot enjoy. My family's survival matters more than my lord's political ambitions, especially when those ambitions appear doomed to failure. The castle fell through treachery rather than assault, as the administrator arranged for critical defenses to be sabotaged while providing intelligence about garrison strength and supply levels. The Terra commander committed seppuku rather than face the shame of surrender, but most of his followers accepted terms that allowed them to transfer their loyalty to the winning side. It was Takeshi's first experience with victory achieved through corruption rather than courage, and the moral complexity troubled him more than he had anticipated. The traditional samurai values that had shaped his education emphasized direct action and personal honor, but practical warfare increasingly required methods that violated those ideals. You learn, observed Sasaki Kojiro, who had accompanied the expedition as a military advisor, that winning and being right are not always the same thing. The question becomes whether achieving righteous objectives justifies using unrighteous methods. The campaign continued through the summer with a series of engagements that tested Takeshi's growing abilities as both a warrior and a leader. Each battle taught new lessons about the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application, while each political negotiation revealed additional layers of complexity in the relationships that held feudal society together. By autumn, his reputation had grown sufficiently that other Minamoto commanders began seeking his advice on matters that ranged from siege warfare to intelligence gathering. The young man who had once struggled with basic sword techniques was becoming recognized as someone whose insights into the changing nature of conflict could influence strategic planning at the highest levels. You have evolved, Lord Yoshitsune observed during one of their increasingly rare private conversations, from a student learning the way of the warrior to a teacher developing new interpretations of what that way might mean in our changing world. It was recognition of growth that came with both satisfaction and burden. Traditional samurai ideals provided clear guidance for individual behavior, but adapting those ideals to the realities of large-scale political conflict required innovations that risked corrupting the very values they were supposed to preserve. As winter approached and both sides prepared for what many believed would be the final phase of the Genpei War, Takeshi found himself questioning not just tactical decisions, but fundamental assumptions about the nature of honor, loyalty, and legitimate authority in a world where old certainties were being challenged by new necessities. The warrior's evolution was not just about developing martial skills or tactical understanding, but about integrating competing demands of idealism and pragmatism in circumstances where pure solutions were rarely available. The path forward required wisdom that no amount of training could provide, only experience could develop, and mistakes could prove fatal. The year 1182 brought challenges that would test not only military capabilities, but the fundamental cohesion of the Minamoto alliance itself. Success in battle had attracted ambitious allies whose motivations were not always aligned with the clan's traditional values, while prolonged warfare had strained relationships between different branches of the family that had previously cooperated out of necessity. Takeshi first noticed the growing tensions during a celebration following their victory at the Battle of Yokodagawara, where Minamoto forces had decisively defeated a Terra army and captured significant quantities of weapons and supplies. The feast that followed should have been a moment of unity and shared triumph, but instead revealed fissures that threatened to undermine everything they had accomplished. Cousin Yashinaka grows too bold. Minamoto no Noriyori confided to Takeshi during a private moment away from the main festivities. His recent successes have convinced him that he deserves recognition equal to Lord Yoshitsune, and he speaks of establishing his own base of operations rather than coordinating with family strategy. The concern was well-founded. Yashinaka had indeed achieved remarkable victories in the northern provinces, but his methods included alliances with local strongmen whose loyalty was questionable and whose values differed significantly from traditional Minamoto approaches to governance. Success was breeding ambition that could fracture their movement just when unity was most essential. "What does my father propose to address this situation?" Takeshi asked, understanding that family politics could prove more dangerous than enemy armies if not managed carefully. Noriyori's expression grew troubled. "That is the difficulty. Any direct action risks creating the very conflict we seek to avoid." Yashinaka commands significant forces and has popular support in regions where his harsh methods have proven effective against Terra influence. We cannot simply order him to submit without risking civil war within our own ranks. The dilemma illustrated the fundamental weakness of any coalition based on family relationships rather than institutional structures. Success attracted ambitious members who demanded greater autonomy, while failure encouraged defection to more promising alternatives. Managing such alliances required political skills that traditional military training did not provide. Over the following months, Takeshi found himself increasingly involved in diplomatic efforts to maintain Minamoto unity while pursuing the war against their common enemies. His role evolved from military commander to political mediator, requiring him to understand motivations and manage relationships that extended far beyond battlefield considerations. The most delicate assignment involved a mission to Yashinaka's headquarters in the mountain province of Shinano, where he was tasked with assessing his cousin's true intentions while attempting to negotiate continued cooperation without appearing to challenge his autonomous authority. The journey required careful preparation and substantial diplomatic skill to avoid triggering the confrontation that everyone feared. "Welcome, young cousin." Yashinaka greeted him with elaborate courtesy that somehow managed to convey both respect and subtle mockery. "I trust your father appreciates the victories that Minamoto arms have achieved in these remote provinces, while he concerns himself with court politics and diplomatic niceties." The comment was carefully calculated to emphasize differences in approach and priorities, suggesting that Yashinaka viewed himself as the true military leader of their movement, while positioning Yoshitsune as someone more concerned with political maneuvering than battlefield achievements. It was a challenge that required careful response to avoid either escalation or apparent submission. "My father values all contributions to our common cause," Takeshi replied diplomatically, "and recognizes that different regions require different approaches to achieve our shared objectives of Terra defeat and political reform." The negotiations that followed lasted for several days, with both sides probing for advantages, while attempting to maintain the fiction that they were family members working toward common goals rather than potential rivals maneuvering for position within a victorious coalition. The discussions revealed how much the character of their movement had changed since the early days of simple resistance to Terra oppression. What had begun as a family struggle for survival had evolved into a complex political coalition where different leaders pursued overlapping but not identical objectives, creating tensions that could prove as dangerous as external enemies. The shadow of power was already falling across relationships that had been forged in the simpler circumstances of shared desperation. "You speak of shared objectives," Yashinaka observed during one particularly difficult session. "But I wonder whether we truly understand each other's vision of what Japan should become after the Terra are defeated. The development of new logical and analytical methods." the creation of comprehensive systems of knowledge that would influence European thought for centuries. But perhaps most importantly, William concluded, we're creating the intellectual foundation for all future development. The shadow of power was already falling across relationships that had been forged in the simpler circumstances of shared desperation. His report to Lord Yoshitsune was carefully worded, but did not conceal the essential truth. The Minamoto coalition was held together by external pressure rather than internal unity, and victory against the Terra might unleash conflicts that could prove more destructive than the war they were fighting to win. Power, his father observed after reading the report, is like water. It flows toward those who can hold it, regardless of who thinks they deserve it. Commercial documents that demonstrated advanced understanding of interest, exchange rates, and profit calculations. Watch, Isabella said, demonstrating calculations on an abacus. With these numbers, I can perform in minutes calculations that would take hours using Roman numerals. Minamoto no Yashinaka had achieved the impossible. His forces had stormed the capital city of Kyoto, driving the Terra from their seat of power and effectively ending their control over the imperial government. Takeshi was among the war council that assembled to hear the detailed reports of this unprecedented victory. But the initial celebration was quickly tempered by disturbing accounts of what had accompanied the military triumph. Architects employ them for engineering computations. Thomas examined commercial problems that required advanced mathematical reasoning. The complexity of these business calculations demonstrates practical application of mathematical knowledge that contradicts assumptions about medieval numeracy. Because medieval merchants aren't simple traders, but sophisticated businessmen who need accurate mathematical tools, Isabella replied. International commerce requires precise calculations of exchange rates, shipping costs, insurance premiums, and profit margins. The evidence of mathematical advancement extended beyond basic arithmetic to geometric and algebraic concepts that were being developed for practical applications. Controlling Kyoto meant commanding the administrative machinery of government, but without the emperor and the sacred treasures, any claim to legitimate authority remained questionable. The Terra had retreated while maintaining their most important political assets. What of the court nobles who remained? Asked Lord Yoshitsune, understanding that governance required more than military occupation. Have they submitted to Yashinaka's authority? Or do they maintain neutrality until the situation clarifies? The answer revealed the depth of the problems created by their cousins' methods. Many aristocrats had fled the capital rather than serve under what they viewed as crude military occupation, while those who remained did so reluctantly and with obvious reservations about the new order. Yashinaka had won control of buildings and bureaucracies, but not the cooperation of people whose expertise was essential for effective administration. There are also reports, the messenger continued hesitantly, of tensions between Yashinaka and Emperor Go-Shirakawa, who has emerged from retirement to reassert imperial authority in the absence of the Terra-controlled child emperor. This development added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Go-Shirakawa was a legitimate retired emperor whose political experience and court connections could provide legitimacy that military force alone could not achieve. However, his relationship with the Minamoto was complicated by years of careful neutrality and his own ambitions for restored imperial influence. The strategic implications were sobering. Yashinaka's victory had achieved their primary military objective of breaking Terra power, but it had also created new problems that required political solutions rather than military ones. Success was proving more difficult to manage than failure had been. We must go to Kyoto, Yoshitsune decided after hours of discussion with his senior advisors. The capital cannot be governed through military occupation alone, and Yashinaka lacks the political skills necessary to transform conquest into legitimate authority. The journey to the ancient capital took Takeshi through landscapes that bore the scars of 3 years of civil war. Abandoned villages and overgrown fields testified to the human cost of their struggle. while the streams of refugees moving along the roads suggested that peace had not yet been achieved despite military victory. Kyoto itself presented a shocking contrast to the elegant city he remembered from his diplomatic missions during the early phases of the conflict. Many of the great mansions stood empty or showed signs of hasty looting, while common people went about their daily business with a wary caution of those who had learned not to trust in the permanence of any political arrangement. The meeting between Yoshitsune and Yashinaka took place in the ruins of what had once been Terra no Kayamori's magnificent palace, now a burned shell that symbolized the destruction of the old order. The setting was grimly appropriate for a conversation about the challenges of creating something new from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. "Welcome to the capital, cousin," Yashinaka said with satisfaction that barely concealed underlying tensions. "As you can see, the Terra nest has been thoroughly cleansed of its former occupants. The question now becomes whether we can convince the imperial court to accept necessary changes in how the realm is governed." The problem was immediately apparent to anyone with experience in court politics. Yashinaka's approach to governance relied heavily on military intimidation and direct action, methods that were effective for conquest but counterproductive for administration. The delicate negotiations required to manage competing court factions demanded subtlety and patience that he clearly lacked. "The court requires careful handling," Yoshitsune observed diplomatically. "These people respond better to consultation than to commands, and their cooperation is essential for establishing legitimate authority that extends beyond military control." Over the following weeks, Takeshi observed the complex dance of coalition politics as different Minamoto leaders attempted to coordinate their efforts while managing their own ambitions and the competing demands of various court factions. The challenge was not simply military anymore, but involved creating stable governance from the chaos of successful revolution. The difficulties were exemplified by negotiations with Emperor Go-Shirakawa, whose cooperation was essential, but whose price for that cooperation included demands that would limit Minamoto autonomy in ways that made many commanders uncomfortable. The retired emperor wanted restoration of imperial prerogatives that had been eroded during decades of military government, while the Minamoto needed to maintain enough control to prevent counter-revolution by their enemies. "Politics," Takeshi observed to his father during one particularly frustrating session, "appears to be more complex than warfare. In battle, victory and defeat are usually clear, but in governance, success and failure often look identical from different perspectives." It was a lesson that would shape his understanding of power and responsibility for the rest of his life. Military victory was only the beginning of the challenges faced by any group that sought to transform society, and managing success required skills that were entirely different from those needed to achieve it. Winter descended upon Kyoto like a judgment from the gods, bringing with it the first serious test of Minamoto governance as food shortages, administrative chaos, and popular unrest threatened to undo everything they had achieved through military victory. Takeshi found himself appointed as one of the coordinators responsible for organizing relief efforts, a role that required him to navigate between competing demands of different social classes while maintaining order in a city where traditional authority structures had collapsed. The magnitude of the challenge became apparent during his first inspection of the urban districts, where common people struggled to survive the disruptions caused by civil war. Markets that had once provided reliable access to rice and other necessities now operated sporadically, if at all, while the complex network of relationships between producers, distributors, and consumers had been shattered by political upheaval. "The problem is not shortage of food," explained Hayashi Sadamian, a merchant whose family had operated in the capital for generations, but breakdown of the systems that normally distribute what is available. Farmers fear to bring their goods to market because they cannot predict whether they will be paid, robbed, or conscripted. Merchants hesitate to invest in inventory that might be confiscated by whatever authority claims jurisdiction this week. It was a sobering reminder that effective governance required more than military control and political legitimacy. The practical systems that sustained urban life depended on trust and predictability that political chaos had destroyed, and rebuilding that foundation would take time and resources that the Minamoto were struggling to provide. The food distribution program that Takeshi helped organize became a laboratory for testing new approaches to the relationship between government and society. Traditional methods had relied on local lords and established merchant families to manage such arrangements, but many of those people had fled or been displaced by the conflict, requiring innovative solutions that drew on untested sources of expertise and authority. "We must work with whoever can deliver results," Takeshi reported to the Governing Council, regardless of their social status or previous political affiliations. "The people need rice, not ceremony, and they will judge our legitimacy by our effectiveness rather than our adherence to traditional protocols." The approach was controversial among Minamoto leaders who worried about the precedent of relying too heavily on non-samurai assistance. But practical necessity gradually overcame theoretical objections. The crisis was too immediate and the available resources too limited to permit the luxury of maintaining rigid social distinctions while people starved. One of the most successful innovations involved partnerships with Buddhist temples, whose networks of communication and mutual assistance had survived the political disruptions better than most secular institutions. Monks and lay believers could distribute aid while maintaining detailed records of who had received what assistance, creating accountability systems that prevented abuse while ensuring that help reached those who needed it most. "The temples provide what government cannot," observed Abbot Jogan of Kofukuji, whose monastery had become a crucial partner in relief efforts. "They offer moral authority that transcends political divisions, administrative competence that has been tested through centuries of operation, and most importantly, the trust of common people who view religious institutions as more permanent than military governments." The collaboration raised interesting questions about the proper relationship between religious and secular authority in Japanese society. "The people need rice, not ceremony, and they will judge our legitimacy by our effectiveness rather than our adherence to traditional protocols." The approach was controversial among Minamoto leaders who worried about the precedent of relying too heavily on non-samurai assistance, but practical necessity gradually overcame theoretical objections. The crisis was too immediate and the available resources too limited to permit the luxury of maintaining rigid social distinctions while people starved. One of the most successful innovations involved partnerships with Buddhist temples, whose networks of communication and mutual assistance had survived the political disruptions better than most secular institutions. Traditional arrangements had generally maintained clear distinctions between these spheres, but the current crisis suggested that effective governance might require more integrated approaches that drew on all available sources of social organization. As spring approached and the immediate crisis began to ease, Takeshi was tasked with drafting recommendations for longer-term administrative reforms that might prevent similar problems in the future. The assignment required him to synthesize everything he had learned about the gap between theoretical governance and practical administration, while addressing concerns of different social groups whose cooperation would be essential for stability. His proposals emphasized the need for institutional structures that could survive changes in political leadership, arguing that effective government required more than the personal qualities of individual rulers. The document represented a significant departure from traditional Japanese concepts of authority, which had generally emphasized personal relationships and moral character rather than systematic approaches to administration. Government, he wrote, must serve the people rather than simply commanding them. Authority that cannot provide security, justice, and prosperity will inevitably be challenged by those who suffer under its failures, regardless of its theoretical legitimacy or historical precedent. The recommendations were well received by Emperor Go Shirakawa, who had grown increasingly frustrated with the limitations of traditional imperial administration, but they generated considerable controversy among Minamoto leaders, who worried about undermining the warrior class's privileged position in society. These ideas, observed Minamoto no Noriyori during one heated discussion, would transform samurai from rulers into civil servants, reducing our status to that of hired administrators rather than hereditary leaders. Is this the result we fought to achieve? The question highlighted fundamental tensions within the Minamoto coalition about what kind of society they wanted to create. Military victory had provided them with the opportunity to reshape Japanese civilization, but it had not resolved disagreements about what direction that reshaping should take. The debate continued through the spring and summer of 1184, with different factions proposing alternative visions of post-war Japan that ranged from restoration of traditional imperial government to establishment of a new form of military administration. Takeshi found himself at the center of these discussions, valued for his practical experience with governance, but also suspected of harboring ideas that were too radical for conservative tastes. The resolution of these questions would determine not just the immediate future of Minamoto rule, but the long-term development of Japanese political culture for centuries to come. The burden of rule was proving heavier than anyone had anticipated when they first took up arms against Terra oppression. The spring of 1185 brought reports that would determine the ultimate outcome of the Genpei War, as Terra forces gathered for what everyone understood would be their final attempt to reclaim the power they had lost through years of defeat and retreat. Intelligence networks that had been carefully developed during the occupation of Kyoto provided detailed information about enemy preparations, but the scale of Terra determination suggested that the coming battle would test Minamoto capabilities to their absolute limits. They have nothing left to lose, analyzed Minamoto no Yoshitsune during the strategic planning session that would shape their response to the Terra challenge. Defeat means not just political destruction, but the elimination of their entire bloodline as a factor in Japanese politics. Desperate men fight with a fury that well-supplied armies cannot match. The Terra had chosen to make their stand at Dan no Yura, a narrow strait between Honshu and Kyushu, where geographical constraints would limit the advantages that Minamoto's superiority in numbers might otherwise provide. It was a calculated gamble that acknowledged their weaknesses while maximizing their remaining strengths, particularly their naval expertise and their control of the child emperor, whose presence legitimized their claim to authority. Takeshi was assigned to command one of the advanced squadrons tasked with reconnaissance and harassment of enemy positions, a role that reflected both his proven competence and his expendability if the mission went wrong. The assignment required him to work closely with naval commanders whose expertise in ship-to-ship combat complemented, but did not replace traditional samurai skills with sword and bow. This will be unlike any battle we have fought, warned Captain Kumagai Neazane, a veteran of dozens of naval engagements whose scarred hands testified to the unique dangers of combat on water. On land, a warrior who falls can sometimes recover and continue fighting. At sea, mistakes are final. Armor becomes a burden that drags you to the bottom, and the ocean shows no mercy to the wounded. The wisdom of this observation became apparent during the preliminary skirmishes that preceded the main battle, as Takeshi discovered that everything he had learned about warfare required adaptation to the unstable platform of a fighting ship and the three-dimensional nature of naval combat. Traditional formations and tactics designed for land warfare proved inadequate for situations where the battlefield itself moved with wind and tide. The final battle began at dawn on a day when unusual tidal conditions created swirling currents that added another element of uncertainty to an already complex situation. Both fleets maneuvered for advantage while trying to avoid being swept into positions that would expose them to devastating attack from superior enemy forces. Takeshi found himself commanding a small vessel whose primary mission involved protecting the flanks of larger ships while maintaining communication between different parts of the Minamoto fleet. The assignment required constant vigilance and frequent repositioning as the tactical situation evolved throughout the morning, with fortunes shifting dramatically as first one side and then the other gained temporary advantages. The turning point came when a group of Terra allies switched sides in the middle of the battle, their defection creating a gap in enemy lines that alert Minamoto commanders immediately exploited. The betrayal was probably motivated by calculations about which side was more likely to emerge victorious, but its impact was decisive in determining the outcome of the entire engagement. "The enemy line is breaking," shouted Captain Kumagai, pointing toward where Terra ships were beginning to scatter rather than maintain formation. "Now is the moment to press our advantage before they can reorganize." What followed was not so much a battle as a pursuit, with fleeing Terra vessels attempting to reach safe harbors, while Minamoto forces hunted them down with systematic efficiency. The personal nature of the conflict became most apparent during these final stages, as individual acts of courage or desperation determined whether particular warriors survived to fight another day or died in the waters of the inland sea. The most dramatic moment came when the child Emperor Antoka's ship was surrounded by Minamoto vessels, leaving his Terra guardians with a choice between surrender and death. According to witnesses, the Emperor's grandmother chose the latter option, taking the sacred imperial regalia and jumping into the sea while holding the 6-year-old ruler in her arms. It was an act that transformed military victory into spiritual catastrophe, as the loss of the sacred treasures raised fundamental questions about the legitimacy of any future imperial government. The regalia represented the divine mandate that justified imperial rule, and their disappearance into the ocean created a crisis of authority that would complicate Japanese politics for generations. "We have won the war," observed Yoshitsune as rescue operations attempted to recover the imperial treasures from the sea floor. "But we may have lost something more important than any military objective. How does one rule an empire whose divine sanction has been literally swallowed by the waves?" The question would haunt the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate and influence the development of Japanese political theory for centuries to come. Victory had been achieved, but at a cost that no one had anticipated when the conflict began. The final storm of the Genpei War had indeed ended Terra resistance, but it had also swept away certainties about the nature of legitimate authority that would prove difficult to replace. As Takeshi helped with the grim task of counting the dead and assessing the political implications of their triumph, he reflected on how completely the boy who had begun this journey had been transformed by the experiences of war and governance. The way of the samurai had indeed led through death, not just the deaths of enemies, but the death of innocence, certainty, and simple faith in traditional answers to complex questions. The silence that followed the Battle of Dan no Yura was more unsettling than the chaos of war had ever been. Takeshi stood on the deck of a Minamoto vessel as it returned to port, watching the sun set over waters that had been stained red with the blood of the Terra clan's final stand. Victory should have brought celebration, but instead it carried the weight of unprecedented responsibility for governing a nation that had been traumatized by 5 years of civil war. The immediate challenges were overwhelming in their scope and complexity. Thousands of displaced persons wandered the countryside seeking homes that no longer existed, while administrative systems that had functioned for centuries lay in ruins after repeated disruptions. Most sobering of all, the loss of the imperial regalia had created a crisis of legitimacy that threatened to undermine any attempt to establish stable government. "Peace," observed Minamoto no Yoritamo, who had emerged as the undisputed leader of their victorious coalition, "requires different skills than war, but no less courage. We must now prove that we can build as effectively as we have destroyed." The task of reconstruction began with a systematic assessment of what had survived the conflict and what needed to be rebuilt from the foundation upward. Takeshi was assigned to lead one of the teams responsible for evaluating conditions in the eastern provinces, where fighting had been less intensive, but economic disruption had still caused significant damage to traditional patterns of life and commerce. The journey through areas that had once been prosperous agricultural districts revealed the true cost of their struggle for political control. Entire villages stood empty, their populations scattered by conscription, flight, or death. Rice paddies had reverted to wilderness for lack of maintenance, while irrigation systems that had sustained communities for generations lay broken and neglected. "The land remembers," said an elderly farmer whose family had worked the same field for centuries. "But the knowledge of how to make it productive again dies with each generation that cannot pass on its wisdom to children who are no longer present to receive it." The observation highlighted one of the most serious long-term consequences of the Civil War: the disruption of cultural transmission that normally preserved essential knowledge about agriculture, craftsmanship, and social organization. Victory had been achieved, but at the cost of destroying much of what made civilization possible. Reconstruction efforts had to address not just physical damage, but the breakdown of trust and cooperation that had enabled complex societies to function effectively. Peasant William stood in his fields outside Canterbury, demonstrating agricultural techniques that had revolutionized European food production and made possible the population growth that supported medieval civilization's remarkable achievements. "The lords may rule the land," he told the scholars, "but we work have created innovations that feed more people better than any previous age in human history." The evidence of agricultural revolution was visible across the landscape. The heavy plow that had opened the rich soils of northern Europe to cultivation. The three-field system that had increased productive capacity by 50%. We must create new forms of organization that can function effectively with the human and material resources that remain available. The challenge was particularly acute in relationships between different social classes, where traditional hierarchies had been disrupted by the practical necessities of wartime cooperation. Merchants had gained influence through their essential role in supplying armies, while peasants had demonstrated military capabilities that challenged assumptions about their proper place in society. The rigid caste system that had once provided stability now seemed inadequate for governing a more complex and dynamic social reality. One of the most innovative experiments involved the establishment of new administrative units that combined military and civilian functions under single authority structures. These arrangements acknowledged that governance in post-war Japan would require integration of security and economic concerns that traditional systems had kept separate, while providing opportunities for advancement based on competence rather than birth. "The old certainties are gone," reflected Emperor Go-Shirakawa during one of the rare private audiences he granted to Minamoto officials. And perhaps that is not entirely unfortunate. Combined with improved grains, it's supporting population levels that double every century. The conversation revealed the scope of medieval agricultural achievement. Water mills that processed grain more efficiently than hand grinding. Windmills that provided power in areas without rivers. Improved breeding that produced stronger horses and more productive cattle. The new horse collar and iron horseshoe have made horses practical for farm work, William noted. A horse can work longer and faster than oxen, increasing productivity dramatically. The evidence extended beyond individual innovations to systematic improvement. Land reclamation projects that brought new areas under cultivation. As Takeshi worked to implement new administrative systems in the territories under his supervision, he found himself drawing on everything he had learned about the gap between theoretical authority and practical effectiveness. The lessons of war proved surprisingly relevant to the challenges of peace, as both required understanding how to motivate cooperation from people whose interests were not automatically aligned with official objectives. The most successful innovations involved partnerships between former enemies who discovered that their mutual interests in stability and prosperity outweighed their historical grievances. Terra survivors who submitted to Minamoto authority often brought valuable expertise that could not be replaced, while their integration into the new order demonstrated that loyalty could be earned through fair treatment rather than simply demanded through force. The weight of peace was proving as challenging as the burden of war had been, but it offered opportunities for creative solutions that military conflict had never permitted. The question was whether the Minamoto could develop the institutional wisdom necessary to manage success as effectively as they had achieved it, creating new forms of artistic expression that would influence Western literature for centuries. "You seek to understand the cultural achievements of our age?" she asked, surrounded by troubadours, poets, and scholars who had gathered for her patronage. "Then observe how we have created entirely new forms of literature that explore the depths of human emotion and psychology." The court was a center of cultural innovation that challenged every assumption about medieval artistic capability. It was a position that required him to translate theoretical principles into practical solutions for communities that were still recovering from the disruptions of civil war. The ceremony that formally invested Yoritomo as shogun took place in Kamakura, the new capital that had been chosen precisely because it represented a break with the court traditions of Kyoto. The setting was symbolic, a military government established in a fortress city that emphasized practical authority over ceremonial elegance, efficiency over aesthetics, and results over precedent. "We gather," Yoritomo announced to the assembled daimyo and retainers, "not to celebrate the restoration of old arrangements, but to inaugurate new forms of governance that can address the challenges our realm faces in a changed world. The authority granted by His Imperial Majesty carries with it obligations that cannot be fulfilled through traditional methods alone." The speech was carefully crafted to acknowledge imperial legitimacy while asserting military independence, establishing the legal framework for a dual system of government that would persist for the next 7 centuries. The shogun would handle practical administration and military affairs, while the emperor would maintain ceremonial authority and spiritual legitimacy, a division of labor that addressed the constitutional crisis created by the loss of the imperial regalia. The new administrative system that emerged from these arrangements reflected everything Takeshi and his generation had learned about the requirements of effective governance in a complex society. Traditional hierarchies were maintained in theory, but modified in practice, with advancement increasingly based on competence and loyalty rather than birth and ancient privilege. Literary themes and techniques being adapted and developed in multiple languages and cultural contexts. Love poetry, heroic romance, religious drama, satirical verse. Marie listed the literary innovations being developed in her court. "We're creating art forms that will influence European literature until the end of time." The evidence extended beyond literature to other cultural achievements. Musical compositions that employed mathematical principles to create unprecedented harmonic complexity. Artistic patronage that supported both religious and secular projects. Power that cannot deliver benefits to those it governs will not survive challenges from those who can provide better alternatives. The advice reflected lessons learned through years of experience with the practical requirements of administration in a society where traditional sources of legitimacy had been weakened by civil war. Success required more than military force or bureaucratic authority. It demanded the ability to solve problems that affected people's daily lives while maintaining support from multiple constituencies with different priorities. The economic policies developed during this period represented perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the New Order, as they acknowledged the importance of commercial activity in ways that traditional aristocratic government had never done. Merchant families who had proven their value during the war were granted official recognition and protection, while new trade regulations encouraged economic development rather than simply extracting revenue from existing activities. Commerce, Yoritomo observed during one policy discussion, is the foundation upon which all other forms of power ultimately rest. A government that cannot ensure prosperity for its subjects will find itself governing subjects who seek prosperity elsewhere. The comment reflected a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between political authority and economic performance that had been rare in previous Japanese governments. The Genpei War had demonstrated the costs of political instability, while Reconstruction had revealed the benefits of policies that encouraged productive activity rather than simply redistributing existing wealth. The new order also had to address the complex legacy of the war itself, particularly the integration of former terrorist supporters who had submitted to Minamoto authority after their clan's defeat. These arrangements required careful balance between mercy and security, forgiveness and accountability, in ways that would establish precedents for how future political conflicts might be resolved. Former enemies, Takeshi recommended in his policy reports, can become the most loyal supporters if they are treated with respect for their capabilities rather than contempt for their previous allegiances. But such integration requires constant vigilance to ensure that forgiveness is not mistaken for weakness. The challenge was particularly acute because many terror survivors possessed administrative and cultural expertise that the militarily focused Minamoto lacked. Effective governance required cooperation from people whose knowledge was essential, but whose loyalty remained questionable, creating ongoing tensions that would influence Japanese politics for generations. As the new administrative system began to function effectively, Takeshi found himself reflecting on how completely his understanding of leadership and authority had evolved since his youth. The boy who had once believed in simple concepts of honor and loyalty had become a man who understood that effective governance required constant compromise between competing values and interests. The new order was not perfect, but it was adaptive, capable of learning from mistakes and adjusting policies based on practical experience rather than theoretical principles. Whether this flexibility would prove to be a strength or a weakness remained to be determined by challenges that the future would bring. The year 1199 brought a crisis that would test every institution and relationship that had been carefully constructed during the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate. Minamoto no Yoritomo, the first shogun and architect of the new order, died suddenly after a riding accident, leaving behind a succession system that had never been fully tested and political arrangements that depended heavily on his personal authority and relationships. Takeshi received news of the shogun's death while conducting an inspection tour of administrative reforms in the northern provinces, where local officials were struggling to implement new tax collection systems without disrupting agricultural production. The message was brief, but its implications were staggering. Everything they had built over the previous decade now faced an uncertain future under leaders who lacked Yoritomo's experience and proven competence. The question observed Hojo Tokumasa, who had emerged as one of the most influential figures in the Regency Council established to guide the teenage heir, is whether our institutions can survive the transition from personal rule to systematic governance. Yoritomo created this system, but he never fully explained how it should function without him. The challenge was compounded by the fact that Yoritomo's eldest son, Minamoto no Yori, was only 18 years old and had limited experience with the complex political and administrative responsibilities that the shogun's position required. His youth was not necessarily disqualifying. Many effective leaders had assumed power at similar ages, but the timing was particularly unfortunate given the delicate state of relationships between different factions within the Minamoto coalition. The Regency arrangements that were hastily established to manage the transition reflected the underlying tensions that had been kept in check by Yoritomo's dominant personality. The Hojo family, who were related to the Minamoto through marriage, but maintained their own power base and political agenda, assumed de facto control over many governmental functions while maintaining the fiction that the young shogun retained ultimate authority. "We are witnessing," Takeshi wrote in a confidential report to his father, "the transformation of military government into something that resembles the court politics we fought to replace." power flows through personal relationships and factional alliances rather than institutional structures, creating vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit if they understood how fragmented our leadership has become. The accuracy of this assessment became apparent within months, as various groups began testing the new government's resolve and capability. Local lords who had submitted to Yoritomo's authority questioned whether those same obligations extended to his inexperienced heir, while court nobles in Kyoto explored possibilities for reasserting imperial prerogatives that had been subordinated to military considerations. Most dangerous of all were the stirrings of discontent within the Minamoto family itself, where different branches began positioning themselves as potential alternatives to the main line if the current shogun proved inadequate. The civil war that had brought them to power had demonstrated how quickly political coalitions could fragment when their leaders appeared weak or illegitimate. Takeshi found himself caught between competing loyalties as his administrative responsibilities required him to implement policies decided by the Regency Council, while his family obligations demanded support for Minamoto interests that were not always identical to those of the current government. The situation was complicated by his growing recognition that effective governance sometimes required decisions that contradicted the wishes of traditional samurai supporters. The choice, he confided to his closest advisor during one particularly difficult period, is not between right and wrong, but between different forms of failure. We can preserve samurai privileges and watch the government collapse from internal contradiction, or we can adapt to changed circumstances and risk losing the support of people who brought us to power. The dilemma was exemplified by debates over taxation policy, where the need for revenue to fund government operations conflicted with traditional expectations that samurai would be exempt from financial obligations to the state. The warrior class wanted the benefits of political control without accepting the costs of administrative responsibility, creating fiscal problems that threatened the viability of the entire system. Military government, observed Hojo Yashitoki during one heated policy session, cannot function according to military principles alone. Soldiers expect to be fed and equipped by their lords, but governors must feed and equip themselves through the productivity of their subjects. The transition requires different thinking about the relationship between rulers and ruled. The comment highlighted fundamental tensions between the warrior ethos that had motivated the Genpei War and the administrative requirements of post-war governance. Success in battle had been achieved through personal valor and group loyalty, but success in government required bureaucratic competence and systematic management of complex relationships. As the crisis deepened through 1212-01, it became increasingly clear that the original Minamoto vision of military government was inadequate for the realities of ruling a complex society. The system would either evolve to address these challenges or be replaced by alternatives that could provide more effective leadership, regardless of their connections to the founding generation. The shadows of succession were revealing weaknesses that had been concealed by the personal authority of exceptional leaders, forcing a new generation to confront questions about the nature of legitimate government that their predecessors had been able to avoid through military success and charismatic leadership. The political crisis that had been building since Yoritomo's death reached its climax in 1203 when a conspiracy, led by Hojo Tokumasa, resulted in the forced abdication of the second shogun and his replacement by an even younger brother whose authority would be entirely dependent on his regent's support. Takeshi witnessed these events from his position as a senior administrator, understanding that he was observing the effective end of Minamoto rule despite the maintenance of ceremonial forms. The coup was executed with surgical precision during a carefully orchestrated hunting expedition, where the deposed shogun was isolated from his supporters and presented with a choice between voluntary retirement and involuntary death. It was a masterpiece of political theater that maintained the fiction of legitimate succession, while ensuring that real power transferred to those capable of exercising it effectively. History will record, observed Takeshi to his son, who had recently reached adulthood and was struggling to understand the meaning of the changes they were witnessing, that the Minamoto founded the shogunate but could not govern it. Power requires more than the ability to seize it. It demands the wisdom to use it constructively and the institutional sophistication to transfer it peacefully. The lesson was particularly painful for someone who had dedicated his life to serving Minamoto interests, only to discover that those interests were not necessarily compatible with effective governance. The warrior virtues that had brought victory in the Genpei War, personal loyalty, martial courage, and clan solidarity, had proven inadequate for the administrative challenges of managing a complex society. The Hojo Regency that emerged from this crisis would govern Japan for the next century, maintaining the forms of Minamoto legitimacy while exercising the substance of political authority through systematic control of governmental institutions. It was an arrangement that worked because it separated symbolic authority from practical responsibility, allowing different groups to satisfy their needs for recognition without conflicting over operational control. The irony, reflected Takeshi during one of his final reports as a government official, is that we achieved our original objective of ending Terra dominance, but we failed to replace it with anything that preserved the values we claim to be defending. The new order is more efficient than what it replaced, but it is also more cynical about the relationship between power and principle. The transformation was most visible in the treatment of former samurai ideals within the new administrative system. Personal honor remained important for individual behavior, but institutional loyalty had replaced family solidarity as the primary virtue expected from government officials. The code of Bushido was being bureaucratized, losing its spiritual dimensions while retaining its practical utility for maintaining discipline and order. Takeshi's own career reflected these broader changes as he gradually transitioned from warrior to administrator to elder statesman, whose primary value lay in his knowledge of how things had been done during the founding period. His experiences bridged the gap between the heroic age of the Genpei War and the systematic governance of the mature shogunate, providing continuity during a period of rapid institutional evolution. The personal cost of these transformations became apparent as he observed how his own children approached their responsibilities in the new order. They were more sophisticated than his generation in their understanding of political complexity, but they also seemed to lack the passionate commitment to abstract ideals that had motivated their elders. Pragmatism had replaced idealism as the dominant virtue. Efficiency had superseded honor as the primary measure of success. Perhaps his eldest son observed during one of their increasingly rare conversations about the meaning of their family service. The age of heroes is ending because the problems we face no longer require heroic solutions. The realm needs administrators more than warriors, negotiators more than champions, systematic thinkers more than inspired leaders. It was a mature assessment that reflected the changed realities of governance in early 13th century Japan, but it also represented a loss that Takeshi felt deeply. The spiritual dimensions of the warrior's path, the emphasis on self-cultivation, the acceptance of death as a teacher, the commitment to principles that transcended material advantage, were being subordinated to practical considerations that reduced samurai to highly skilled civil servants. The twilight of honor was not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual fade, as each generation adapted more completely to circumstances that made traditional virtues seem increasingly irrelevant. The code of Bushido would survive and even flourish in later periods, but it would be systematized and romanticized rather than lived as an organic response to genuine spiritual and political challenges. As Takeshi prepared to retire from active government service, he reflected on the irony that their military victory had created conditions that made military virtues obsolete. Peace was the greatest achievement of his generation, but it was also the solvent that dissolved the warrior culture that had made peace possible. The way of the samurai would continue, but it would be transformed by success into something that its founders might not recognize as their legacy. In the spring of 1221, nearly 4 decades after the Battle of Dan no Yura had ended the Genpei War, Takeshi stood in the gardens of his ancestral estate watching his grandson practice sword forms that had been passed down through generations of Minamoto warriors. The boy's technique was flawless, his dedication obvious, but something essential was missing: the sense of desperate necessity that had given meaning to such training during the age of constant warfare. The Jokyu disturbance, as historians would later call Emperor Go-Toba's failed attempt to overthrow the Hojo Regency, had just been crushed with efficiency that demonstrated how completely the balance of power in Japan had shifted toward systematic military government. The brief conflict served as a reminder that the imperial court retained ambitions for restored authority, but also revealed how thoroughly those ambitions had been divorced from practical capability. "Tell me, grandfather," the boy asked during a break in his training, "why do we continue to practice these arts when there are no more wars to fight? The Hojo maintain peace, trade prospers, and scholars speak of our age as one of unprecedented stability." It was a question that cut to the heart of everything Takeshi had been contemplating during his years of retirement from active service. The samurai class had achieved its political objectives so completely that it had eliminated the conditions that had created its identity and purpose. Success had bred a crisis of meaning that no amount of institutional innovation could resolve. "We practice," Takeshi replied carefully, "because the virtues these forms teach remain valuable even when their original applications have disappeared. Discipline, precision, acceptance of mortality. These qualities serve human development regardless of whether they are needed for literal combat." It was a philosophical answer that satisfied neither his grandson's practical curiosity nor his own deeper concerns about the direction of Japanese society. The transformation of Bushido from lived necessity to cultural performance was perhaps inevitable, but it represented a loss that could not be easily quantified or replaced. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger bearing news that would provide the final punctuation to Takeshi's long involvement in the political evolution of his country. Minamoto no Sanetomo, the third and last shogun of the Minamoto line, had been assassinated in Kamakura by his own nephew, ending forever the fiction that the founding family retained control over the government they had created. "So it ends," Takeshi murmured to himself, understanding that he was witnessing the completion of a historical cycle that had begun with his father's decision to resist Terra dominance decades earlier. The Minamoto had succeeded beyond their wildest ambitions, establishing institutions that would govern Japan for centuries, but their success had eliminated the need for their continued leadership. The Hojo Regency would continue to rule in the name of puppet shoguns drawn from imperial or Fujiwara lineages, maintaining the forms of legitimacy while exercising the substance of authority through bureaucratic competence and military efficiency. It was a system that worked precisely because it separated symbolic requirements from operational necessities, allowing different groups to satisfy their psychological needs without interfering with practical governance. As news of Sanetomo's death spread throughout the domain, Takeshi observed the reactions of different generations to what should have been a traumatic political crisis. Older retainers who remembered the Genpei War expressed genuine grief for the end of their clan's direct rule, while younger administrators focused on ensuring that governmental functions continued without disruption. The institutional structures they had helped create were proving more durable than the family relationships that had originally justified them. The legacy, he explained to his assembled family during the memorial service for their last shogun, is not the continuation of Minamoto rule, but the establishment of governmental systems that can function effectively regardless of who occupies nominal positions of authority. We have created something larger than ourselves, even if we can no longer control it. The comment reflected a mature understanding of political development that had taken decades of experience to achieve. The warrior's path had led through victory and governance to a form of wisdom that transcended personal or family ambitions, recognizing that true success lay in creating institutions that served purposes beyond the immediate interests of their founders. During the final years of his life, Takeshi devoted himself to recording the lessons he had learned during his journey from young samurai to elder statesmen. His writings would become part of the intellectual foundation for later developments in Japanese political thought, though he could not have anticipated how his insights would be interpreted and applied by future generations facing different challenges. The Way of Steel, he wrote in his most famous passage, teaches that true strength comes not from the hardness that resists all pressure, but from the flexibility that bends without breaking. A sword that cannot yield will shatter when tested by forces greater than itself, but one that combines hardness with resilience can endure for centuries. It was a metaphor that captured his understanding of how the samurai class had evolved from pure warriors to adaptive administrators, maintaining their essential character while transforming their methods to address changed circumstances. The legacy of steel was not just military tradition, but the capacity for continuous renewal that allowed institutions to survive the conditions that had created them. As the sun set over his mountain domain for the last time, Takeshi reflected on the strange journey that had taken him from the rigid certainties of his youth to the complex wisdom of his final years. The way of the samurai had indeed been death, the death of old assumptions, old identities, and old limitations. But it had also been rebirthed into forms of service and understanding that his younger self could never have imagined. The shadow that stretched across feudal Japan as the 13th century progressed would be shaped by institutions and traditions that bore the mark of his generation's struggles. But it would also reflect the continuing evolution of Japanese society toward forms of organization that balanced stability with adaptability. The legacy of steel would endure, but it would be tempered by the wisdom that comes only through the patient acceptance of change as the one constant in human affairs. The end. Thus concludes The Way of Steel and Shadow, the saga of Takeshi Minamoto, and his journey through the transformation of feudal Japan during the Genpei War and the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate. This epic spans the years 1180 to 1221, covering the Genpei War, the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate, and the final extinction of direct Minamoto rule, events that established the foundations of Japanese military government for the next 7 centuries.